On the day 18th of the month of June at the Notary, City of Belgium, we begin.
Hello, everyone. So first, we'll make a very brief introduction of the authors of this book. So, Andrey, Ramirez, Quiros, sorry. He's an author, journalist, and a Spanish language teacher, and a master in political communication. He studied journalism at the San Judas Tadeo University, educational teaching at the Universidad Estatal Nacional a Distancia, and received his specialization in Spanish as a second language at the Instituto Tecnológico de Costa Rica. He has been dedicated to cultural and artistical research for years, has published 13 books, and has also participated in and directed cultural events in Costa Rica, Panama, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala, Mexico, and Ecuador. Sebastian Ortiz was admitted to the study of philosophy at the University of Costa Rica. Then he went on to study law. In the year 2017, the Journal of Market Processes published his review of Limón Real by countryman Rigoberto Stewart. In 2019, the scientific committee at the Universidad del Rey Juan Carlos, headed by Professor Dr. Jesus Huerta de Soto, selected his paper, STEM, meaning science, engineering, technology, and mathematics, and the Free Society, which Mr. Ortiz represented at the third annual Austrian Economics Conference in Madrid, Spain. For the past 2 years, Mr. Ortiz has been unable to work legally in the Netherlands because after he and his wife, who is Dutch, married, the embassy of the Netherlands in Costa Rica was closed due to the COVID lockdowns. That and no response from the embassy meant he had to travel to the Netherlands and apply from there, which meant the rejection of his application for residency and the beginning of a painfully long legal process of appeal asking to be able to work for his family. This book was written during those years in which he has been possibly unemployed. I supervised and oversaw the production of the book myself, book which is unequivocally peculiar in that he dictated it to me via audio messages while doing house chores. I transcribed it, edited, and wrote the prologue. Another interesting aspect of his book is that it is therefore the joint collaboration of a capitalist, Sebastian, and myself, a socialist. So a collaboration inspired by the deep conviction that peace and not force is the way for society to move forward. Well, the thing is that according to this information or to this introduction, so I would like to share with you guys my experience as a teacher, teaching literature in the Costa Rican prisons. So, and by that time, so I saw the opportunity, to transmit this knowledge and also to understand that the arts, talking in general, have the capacity to reinsert these people, into the society. So, and also I saw, this analogy with Sebastian's case, in order to understand that he was in this difficult circumstance where his rights were completely restricted by the Netherlands government. And so I felt touched in that specific moment. So, and I decided to collaborate with this project. I'm involved in this because of that. And it's something that not only because he's a very talented and very scholar person, he likes a lot to investigate about these topics and these subjects. it's also because, well, this for me, when I read it the first time, so I consider that is an excellent contribution to the spread of anarchism ideas. So that's why I'm here now in this presentation and feeling this gratitude with you guys, to share with us this space, for doing this, of course. And according to this, well, I would like to hear him, speaking also about the presentation of this project.
Thank you, Andrey. I would like to begin by thanking the owners of the Hotel The Notary in Bruges, Belgium, for their great hospitality and the opportunity to discuss ideas that go beyond the limits of what is legal into the political, the philosophical, and the ethical conception of freedom. Last night, we stayed in the Henry Hazlitt suite. As everyone knows, Henry Hazlitt wrote the great Economics in One Lesson. And from a perspective of political science and libertarian natural law, the contents of our book, which we are presenting today, are an attempt to explain force, interpersonal fiscal force, enforcement in one lesson. I would like to also thank my wife, Carmen, my stepson, Matthias, my mother, Victoria, also, because like this hotel in Bruges, they have made the world a more hospitable, peaceful, and beautiful place for me. Now, someone might say, Sebastian, you are just restating in a particularly legalistic or juridical manner things that you learned from other thinkers. And you are trying to use these people as a podium in order to do so. And while that may be true, I would like to bring the attention to the fact that since World War II, the politically correct worldview as far as politics and law is concerned is social democracy. Now, of course, it is very easy to take a position as a person in life where you do whatever is cheapest and without risk. And someone may say, well, these people, these other professors that preceded you, came to the general masses and said, do you like peace? Yes. Are you against attacking people? Yes. Well, I have the perfect ideology for you. And that this is a cheap trick akin to doing something that tacitly lets you know, I am a good person, probably better than you. And don't you know, I have this ideology that shows you that that is the case. And yet, because social democracy was the predominant worldview after World War II, I don't completely dismiss these professors. Of course, I want something out of this to manifest in the world. As a Latin American, I am very cognizant of the fact that there are people in Venezuela, people in Cuba, who would like to engage in entrepreneurship and division of labor, and they are politically not able to. As Andrey mentioned, I have had my fair share of that. And so it seems to me that the tyranny of the overreach from the state is of such a kind that the access to the means of cooperation and collaboration have been restricted. I want a society for my children and grandchildren where becoming rich in a single lifetime is relatively easy. Now, Regarding the authors I refer to in the book, I have read their works and have met most of them in person. Hoppe, Hans-Hermann Hoppe, Stefan Kinsella, Huerta de Soto, Gerard Casey, Frank Van Doon. The latter two stand out for having had the deepest influence on me, and therefore on my work. In the first case, Gerard Casey, as it relates to him, a very good and close friend of mine from Dublin, Ireland, the emphasis pertains to the influence of Jesus of Nazareth, Messiah and my God, on the world of ideas, in the sense of justice, in this part of the world, Western Europe, even my home country, Costa Rica. After discussing the role of Christian sensibilities and culture with Andrey, a large section of the book has been taken out to develop it further in a future work, which was met with enthusiasm and encouragement from Professor Casey. In the future, that work, expanding on my eccentric theological, perhaps heretic opinions, will be called Libertarian Christianity. Excommunicate me. I should say that my father died when I was 9, my stepfather died when I was 26. I met Professor Casey in 2013 when I was 28. At the time, I had already read his masterwork, Libertarian Anarchy. In many ways, he has been like a father to me. Whereas my relationship to the work of Professor Van Doon, a native of this land, Flanders, Belgium, has been very unique. One could say easily that my views on freedom have been most influenced by his. I should be straightforward and say what I like about Professor Van Doon's work, his emphasis on language, the original meaning of words, the historical and juridical depth of his reflections concerning the development of Western law, which I think are unparalleled, with perhaps the exception being Scottish scholar Alan J. Watson, with the difference being that Van Doon is a libertarian and a realist in the Platonic metaphysical tradition of Anselm of Canterbury, Anselm of Beck. To take a look at law and freedom in a serious manner, not merely as a systems builder, as an ideologue, but as someone with an interest into the insight of what is the meaning of justice, requires, in my opinion, becoming acquainted with the work of Frank Van Doon. I have worked assiduously on the translation of his masterpiece, The Fundamental Principle of Law. My own work is an attempt at a more pragmatic take on what I think embodies a constitutional criterion of political freedom. That is, what is the most fundamental, incontrovertible principle of law required in the transit to a society without institutional aggression. As a student of justice and law in the continental tradition, I think Van Doon's works are indispensable to anyone in Europe and Iberian America to understand the consequences ideas have in our history. I think there is fertile terrain in Van Doon's work for those interested in the sociology of law. Those familiar with his work on Somalia will probably benefit greatly from viewing the history of Rwanda, a country whose history is intimately connected to Belgian and international political decisions, and the events, the genocide that took place in the early 90s, considering Van Doon's work on the utopia of human rights, yet to be translated into English. Among the dead authors who I did therefore never got to meet personally, stand out for their greatest influence on my thinking, Professor of Psychiatry, Thomas Schasch, S-Z-A-S-Z, and Samuel Edward Conkin. Without a doubt, all of these authors I mentioned have had an influence on each other and form part of a tradition. For example, in Van Doon's The Fundamental Principle of Law's epigraph, there seems to be a conceptual continuation of Rothbard's quoting Reverend Elisha Williams in the epigraph of the Ethics of Liberty. If one were to read them one after the other, that is, the quotes as appear first in Rothbard and then in Van Doon, then it would read, as reason tells us, all are born thus naturally equal. That is, with an equal right to their persons. So also with an equal right to their preservation. And every man having a property in his own person, the labor of his body, and the work of his hands, are properly his own, to which no one has right but himself. It will therefore follow that when he removes anything out of the state that nature has provided and left it in, he has mixed his labor with it and joined something to it that is his own, and thereby makes it his property. Thus, every man having a natural right to, or being proprietor of his own person and his own actions and labor, which we call property, it certainly follows that no man can have a right to the person or property of another. And if every man has a right to his person and property, he has also a right to defend them, and so has a right of punishing all insults upon his person and property. In Rothbard's book, and I quote, that was in Rothbard's book, and I quote then in Van Doen's book, and legal tyranny arises whenever there is a departure from this simple principle. By Elisha P. Hurlbut. I point this out because whereas reading Van Doen will provide a sensitivity to the influence ideas have on the convivial order, samenleving in Dutch, Shash will make one profoundly aware of the consequences that the law enforcement and the medical powers of the state will have as influence on the day-to-day life of individuals. This is all the more noticeable as erstwhile during his lifetime it seemed to be the task of Dr. Sass to present a critique of general medical policy coming from the state. Of course, Thomas Sass died in 2012, 8 years before the Covidista closures and injections. So he did not get to enjoy the politically caused chaos that we all had to live through. Some of us even died through. And yet, my experience of having for the first time in my life as a producer of audiovisual content had a small production curtailed and picked cold by the host's computer indicates to me that Professor Van Doen's thoughts on the coronavirus from the 18th of May, 2021, they are available online, are not too distant from what would have otherwise been Dr. Sass's own views. My own book is framed within the context of the idea that, to use the terms of jurist Carl Schmitt, from the perspective of any person who cares about freedom as the greatest gift from God that humans have, we are in a state of emergency, not a state of law, a state of exception, a state of legislation, which is a state of affairs that leaves a lot to be desired. That desire is what involves the great late Samuel Edward Conking III. His desire for freedom in a real, immediate sense inspired a lot of the insinuations, implications, and literary strategic perspectives of my book. Anyone familiar with the work of Jesus González Maestro, professor of literary theory at the University of Vigo in Spain, knows that, as he has mentioned, for example, in his work on laughter in Don Quixote, and I quote, translating for partial educational purposes, power can only be seduced, defeated, or evaded. Before cryptocurrencies, before Bitcoin Cash and Monero, the one who came up with the idea that the state should be evaded in the counter economy until it could be defeated was Samuel Edward Conking. The ideas that I propound regarding legal and constitutional reform in my book, including the decriminalization of failure to render payment to the fiscal authorities, are largely inspired by Conking, and also the awareness of the fact that during the same relevant time period of the years from 2020 through to 2022, those who promoted the parallel economy, such as John McAfee, Ian Freeman, Roger Ver, suffered incarceration, and in the case of John McAfee, even death in a jail cell in Spain. What greater evidence that our freedom in the West is in a state of emergency? Nevertheless, a sword can be picked up and used for bad, worse, evil ends, or for good, better, and the best ends available. A current example of this is the administration of affairs by President Bukele in El Salvador, whose suspension of the constitution and the law has been used to safeguard the security of the citizens against the plunder, violence, and chaos brought about by the gangs. He effectively has arrested the gangs. This shows that it is possible to use force in a defensive way and not to the detriment of society. It should be noted that the institutional context of Bukele is the same as that of the Austrian Chancellor of the 1930s in Germany, a democratically elected leader with a Congress who declares state of emergency and is given plenipotentiary rights to rule over the country. The same kind of phenomenon within the context of the same kind of Western institutions. Only in the case of Bukele, force has been used to defend rather than to destroy the inhabitants. Now, on the book proper. The first edition of my book, the original, whose pre-sale presentation is today, is in Spanish, Español. The idea of the book began around the time I began the formal study of law in San Jose in 2016. That means that originally it was meant to be a dull, boring academic book on law that nobody would want to buy or read, except for a small margin of the population, libertarian theory enthusiasts and jurists. Instead, I modified the style, the title, and the content so as to offer a popularization of ideas about freedom to the audience of Spanish and Portuguese speakers in the post-Corona, post-Javier Milei world. I should say that the experience of married life and being unable to work due to residence appeals brings to the fore the importance of selling books rather than just writing. So there was a bit of marketing in the aforementioned relevant changes in style. Javier Milei, having become the first president in history to self-describe as an anarcho-capitalist during my lifetime, combined with the facts that written Spanish is upwards of 89% or more intelligible to Portuguese speakers, and that therefore there is a number of 300 million Portuguese speakers and about 600 million Spanish speakers, for a total approaching 1 billion of the world's population, made the decision to write the first version of my book in Spanish an intuitive entrepreneurial choice, as well as a natural one, since I myself am a native Spanish speaker. I should say that because English is frequently learned on a voluntary basis by non-English speakers, it is the most spoken language in the world. And because Mandarin Chinese is learned on an involuntary basis in the People's Republic of China, it is the second most spoken language in the world. But the most spoken Indo-European language in the world as a native tongue, as a mother language, is Spanish. This linguistic fact of life is perhaps of greater importance than the fact that I am genetically Spanish and of native of the Americas descent mixed together. Of course, there are those who, like neuroscientist Robert Sapolsky from Stanford University, would have you think that we humans are a little more than food processing and gene propagating biological machines, determined, as it were, by one's genome. However, to quote from my translation of Professor Frank van Doon's The Fundamental Principle of Law, and I quote, "The scientist who pretends that people are not creatures of rational essence proves by his activity that they are. He accepts a hypothesis that implies that what he does is impossible." So the fact that I am a Spanish speaker belonging to the Spanish-speaking world, and so are my intended audience, is more important than the biological fact of my ancestry. Because the essence of being Spanish is not racial. Much has been said that the tradition of the West, the Western world, to which the Spanish-speaking world belongs, is composed of some basic elements. For example, Professor Andrey in his book, The Invisible Proportion, has referred to the Christian faith, Greek philosophy, and the Roman law. The word tradition itself means handing something over, the delivery of something from generation to generation, from the Latin tradere, to hand over, cognate with the English trade. Thus, being that the Spanish tradition of the West has some unique elements, I have tried to reflect on those as the context of the ideas that I present in my book. To be more specific, imagine a place where Christianity outlived the Roman Empire, a place that was multi-ethnic but monocultural, with the same language and the same faith. Indeed, Spain was populated by Celts, Phoenicians, Romans, Germanic Visigoths, who after the fall of Rome, those Visigoths, kept the rule of law by means of the Visigothic Code. Followers of a religious faith that began from the followers of a man who was betrayed by his people, by his friend, and who, being innocent, was murdered by the political authorities. Fast forward 5 centuries after the death of that man, and said Roman authorities are gone. The empire has collapsed, but not the rule of law and not the Christian faith. Imagine also a place where those same Hispano-Roman and Visigothic Christians were conquered. And then, at the end of almost 8 centuries of intergenerational perpetual war against what was perceived to be a totalitarian manner of life incompatible with Christian freedom, no division of church and state, a doctrine that says that you can lie in the name of division, lie in the name of religion, something that would be impossible from the Christian faith that says that truth shall set you free. And the idea of conquest as a means of conversion, also incompatible with the Christian faith. After 8 centuries of intergenerational war against what was perceived to be a totalitarian manner of life incompatible with Christian freedom, they, of different ethnicities, Castilians, Asturians, Basque, under the banner that Christ is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, took back the ancient Roman province of Hispania, comprised of Portugal and Spain, for themselves, for their Christian kingdoms. Typing Reconquista on Wikipedia will yield the line, pursuant to an Islamophobic worldview, the concept is a symbol of significance for the 21st century European far right. As if the history of the Spanish people could be reduced to an irrational impulse which can be identified with the conservative wing of the National Assembly of the French Revolutionaries, the right, where the term the right comes from. As a trivial historical curiosity, I should say that for the Spanish, just as for the Belgian, in the context of relations with the French, Flanders too belonged to the Habsburg crown, as Spain did. As a matter of fact, Flanders, Costa Rica, and the Netherlands, where I currently live, all belong to the same Habsburg crown during the reign of Charles V. Typing Spanish War of Independence on Wikipedia will actually show that as far as it pertains to the left or right of the French National Assembly, it was actually against Napoleon's revolutionary France that Spain fought for its independence. The first modern constitution of the entire Spanish-speaking world, which means the first constitution of Spain and of Costa Rica, my home country, the Constitution of Cadiz of 1812, which never came into force, largely due to the priority of the Napoleonic threat, states, the Spanish nation consists of all Spaniards of both hemispheres. Imagine a place where revolutionary Marxist-Leninism was stopped and defeated by force. That is what happened in Spain under Franco, and also in Chile under Pinochet. Imagine a place where the army, the peacetime standing army, was abolished as a branch of the state. That happened in Costa Rica, where I come from. It is in this context that I wrote my book, a context that aims to prevent the false identity of individuals' sentimentalism or authenticity, as Professor Kinniging from the University of Leiden would say, as he would say, one's own redefinition of one's deepest self. To say, I want to be accepted as a cat because I feel like a cat. No, there is no better way to become what one is, to paraphrase Nietzsche, than to look at the tradition one inherited. In the Spanish context, the tradition of feudalism can be seen as foreign. Spain was composed of free owners, not feudal serfs. The tradition of the nation state can be seen as foreign. The ideas of the element of the nation state, namely territory, population, and sovereign government, are a consequence of the Protestant peace treaty of Westphalia, which was influenced by the totalitarian idea that the subjects had to be of the religion of the ruler. Those are German, not Spanish ideas. As a matter of fact, the tradition that says that if a king becomes tyrannical and forces the population to do things against common morality, that there is a duty to assassinate him, is particularly Spanish, namely that of the priest Juan de Mariana. Same goes for the tradition of arguing that the subjects of a king of the king have the right to disobey him or revolt if he has been excommunicated. That goes back to the work of Francisco Suarez. A Spanish view that power is given from God to mankind and not to the rulers, so that the people can take it back if the rulers become tyrannical. This has nothing to do with totalitarian ideas of the social contract by Hobbes and Locke, which were foreign, English, to the Spanish world. Something Professor Van Doon has noted in Chapter 5 of the Fundamental Principle of Law. The ideas of Lenin are also foreign, Russian, not part of the Spanish tradition. To understand my tradition is to know that, as Robert Hicks has pointed out in a lecture to the Mises Institute, the modern nation state as an ideology of enforcement is too dangerous to be tolerated. Thus, the discipline of history, as an account of commonly witnessed true events, gives context to the discussion of political science, of the right and wrong use of power or enforcement. Not only right and wrong, better and worse among the alternative ideas and practices that present themselves to us, as opposed to a mere intuitionism of doing what feels right from moment to moment, which is not the same as one's conscience. That is knowledge held in common with others, as Professor Van Doon has pointed out, from the original Latin word conscientia, con, with, scientia, knowledge. In Dutch, geweten, what is known. That is why the very introduction of my very boring book tries to be ironic, funny, anarchic, as well as extremely serious, quoting a prayer from the Spanish Visigothic rite of the Catholic Mass. I should say that I wrote the book in a way that a Spanish speaker from any place in the Spanish-speaking world, even after a long day of work, 16 hours or so, could read this and go, this guy's crazy. That's funny. What's this guy? I'm going to Google this. And so my aim is to inspire people to have principles, convictions, and the means necessary to be successful in making one's way in life by facing and overcoming obstacles like an entrepreneur does. The book itself is about a dogmatic criterion of constitutional law. That, in simple English, means this. In Greek, krinein means to sift, to pass through a colander, to discriminate between the wheat and the chaff, the good and the bad, the better and the worse. A criterion is a lens that provides you with a favorable framing bias towards some things and a negative framing bias against some things. Dogmatic comes from the Greek word dogma, which means truth. Therefore, I tried to come up like a carpenter with a fundamental measure of what is right and wrong for all contexts, ethical, moral, political, juridical, even in no man's land, like the Good Samaritan, so that it can serve as the foundational principle to what I call a constitutional anarchy, a politically organized society where there is legitimate defense, either directly exercised, volunteered by people coming to the aid of others, or paid for as a service, but there is no power, no enforcement. To, in one line, provide an objective method that answers the basics of a country where the inhabitants have decided it is time to make the transition away from a nation-state-based society into a free society. History will show that what the followers of Rothbard have referred to as the non-aggression principle was formulated earlier, among others, by Benjamin Constant. It has been pointed out by Kinsella that Rothbard's theory of libertarianism presumes a theory of property rights. Hoppe's theory is a justification of property rights. In my opinion, after careful inspection, not a very good one. The logical deficiencies have already been critiqued elsewhere by David Gordon. To say that nobody has a better claim to one's own body than the person who has direct control over it themselves, in my opinion, is weak. And a non sequitur when one considers that even when you retain full direct control over your body, there are ends that you may not pursue, means that you may not use. These are derived from the nature of matter, will, and intellect, and not purely from internal logical coherence of arguments. For example, murder, which is the killing of someone innocent who has not killed anyone themselves, is an unethical end. Rape, which is forceful sexual subjugation, is an unacceptable means of pursuing sexual satisfaction. The unacceptable and intolerable character of both mean others are free to use force in response to defend against those. It also means against those who choose those ends and means. It also means one is not free to act in such ways. This means it is not the pure logic of action, but the deontology of ethics, meaning the requirement that ethical rules accord with the essential nature of man and reality that makes these things evil. It is in the form of created things. It is God-given. Hoppe claims that David Hume's objection that you cannot derive a should, what you should do, what you shouldn't do, an ought, from an is, how things are, that very rejection of deontology by David Hume applies to all ethical theories and not libertarianism alone. And that therefore, this is a definition so broad that it is useless as a critique. This statement I find impotent and fails to condemn moral skepticism and nihilism. My view is that the libertarian theory of individual freedom and property rights coheres better with the two great commandments given by Christ, and therefore with the authentically Western Christian tradition. Of course, I am not sure if Hoppe is in a geographical position to say this kind of thing. He has recently mentioned how in his native Germany, nobody is legally in a position of freedom to speak critically about the government anymore. Namely, what I say is that to love the greatest good imaginable, the two great commandments, the greatest good imaginable, whose virtues are not mutually exclusive and do not enter into conflict, that is to love goodness, pure goodness above all things, God, and to do unto others as one would want done unto oneself, that coheres best with the libertarian conception of law. Kinsella's limitations on Rothbard and Hoppe's theory of private property, that only physical objects, not ideas or methods, can be legitimately owned, is therefore also a good definitive explanation of the meaning of what is compatible with the Roman law that justice is to give to each what is his and not to harm others. The criterion I present in my book is defined so as to ensure this is made explicit. Here it is worth mentioning that I have avoided the academic impotence of constant talk about economics. In my presentation to the editor of the manuscript of the book, I wrote about how in the early 20th century, two Austrian citizens who fought and were veterans of World War I pursued different paths. One became the greatest economist who ever lived, to his great prestige, posterity, and profit. The other became the Chancellor of Germany, to the ruin of the German people, including the ethnically Jewish Germans. One was Mises, the other was Hitler. The position I take in the book is not that of idealism, but of voluntarism. Where there is a will, there is a way. And so it is better to be a politician than an economist for Javier Milei. In a situation of emergency, the stakes are too high to sing praises about how social cooperation, collaboration, coordination make everyone richer. Indeed, If Spain said and Portugal said, now all people from Spanish and Portuguese speaking countries can become Spanish citizens, the Latin Americans, 680 million people in the world, that would mean that as EU citizens, they, the Latin Americans, would flood Europe to engage in division of labor, to have access to the means of cooperation, coordination, and collaboration in the entrepreneurial market of human action, most probably starting by Venezuela and Cuba, would you see a lot of Hispanics. Therefore, I would say that the larger part of the population is not made out of would-be martyrs or terrorists, people who would either risk and give their life for good or risk and give their life for evil at all costs. And that means that people will obey. And in that context, it is important that those who understand the rules of right and wrong, of freedom and conviviality, prevail in power. For this reason, Rothbard was better than Mises. He emphasized natural law instead of the maximization of subjective value through division of labor and capital accumulation. As noted in Power and Market, trade to buy and sell presumes the respect for private property. Otherwise, you would just take from people. As noted by Hoppe in his theory of socialism and capitalism, the state presumes the violation of private property. 20th century socialisms, from National Socialism to Marxist-Leninism, and 20th century statist capitalism shows that for men of action, of entrepreneurs, of principles, peaceful men, the stakes are too high for idle talk about human action. Rothbard mentioned how people tend to specialize in what they are worst at, almost as if to overcompensate. This is noteworthy considering he studied mathematics and economics, and his best works are where he makes traditionally Christian natural law arguments. Kinsella is an electrical engineer and he studied law. Professor Jesus Huerta de Soto studied law and is an economist. David Friedman did not study law, but he taught law, only in America. It seems as if Professors Casey, Gerard Casey, and Frank Van Doon are the only ones not suffering from Rothbard's principle. I am quite happy not to have finished the study of law, lest my license be revoked, as I think happened to Twan Manders in the Netherlands. Now, one difference between my book and those of Rothbard, David Friedman, in his Machinery of Freedom, and other authors like Walter Block, is I don't discuss jurisprudence or case law or hypothetical situations where you need an arbiter, someone to be Solomonic about punishment and verdict, about how things would be handled in a free society. I provide a single principle that serves as method so that it is clear when self-defense is warranted and when, at the discretion of witnesses and service providers and defenders, after a due process has taken place, someone may be found to be in the wrong. While I do take into account the works of academic professors who have for decades been arguing that the state is unjust because of A, B, and C, and logically justifying the alternative principles, my book is an educated man's opinion on what is the most practical way their conception of justice, what is the most practical way in which their conception of justice may be or can be forcefully imposed from the top and then described as law in the initial stage of transition between statism towards freedom, in a way that is compatible with traditional Western views of what is just. If the Western world is made out of Greek philosophy, Christian religion, and Roman law, my focus on law aspires to bring the element of force to the discussion, not force as conquest. but force as reconquista, reconquest. How can these views from these philosophers, who have already justified them, be forced upon everyone, that is, enforced? We already know that they are relatively and absolutely more just than the current alternatives: state law, statism as an ideology of enforcement. This is informed by history, in particularly the history of Spanish-speaking peoples, in which the entire country was taken back over a period of 700 years after they were conquered. Spanish history, in which Franco was the de facto monarch after defeating the Marxist-Leninists in war. And I don't say that facetiously, as an inflammatory comment. Franco wielded more power, according to historian George Stanley Payne, than any preceding king. Monarchy in the traditional Aristotelian definition is the rule by one, whereas aristocracy is ruled by that minority of people who are excellent, and democracy is the rule by many. Franco was the de facto monarch of Spain, after he defeated in war the Marxist-Leninists, as is also the case, for example, with Pinochet in Chile. What I do with my criterion is to present a framing bias of what is considered relevant from the perspective of force, so that if it were the single principle of a provisional constitution, it would suffice, so that everyone knows what they have to do and what they have not to do, or put otherwise, what will probably get them shot to death in the new free zone. To borrow from Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident, unquote. And I say that people have bodies, that those bodies can be damaged, that when people defend themselves, the purpose of force is to prevent irreversible physical damage to their body, and that preservation of individual wealth is the meaning of private property, and that in this educated man's opinion, that is justice. The second interesting part of the Declaration of Independence of the United States of America is the idea the American revolutionaries borrowed from Francisco Suarez, namely that, and I quote, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter it or to abolish it. This book gives both the principle of its abolition and of its alteration in one forcefully defensible, contrast that to logically justifiable, phrase. What matters is that freedom as a consequence of self-defense is effective in the real world. When I say real, that relates to reality, that from our side of life, that is, from the side of this world, not the afterlife, means a world that is made of materials. The word that comes from the Latin wood, in Spanish, madera, the School of Translators of Toledo used and introduced in the Indo-European languages to mean physical things, tangible things. And so we live in a world of matter. So in the real world, self-defense being effective is paramount. And not that a subculture of libertarians promise sincerely that they have a solution to every foreseeable problem. Caring about properly understood freedom is not synonymous with being a utopian idealist. When a political scientist who happens to be an anarcho-libertarian presents the view, the perspective of the libertarian, politically organized community, he is not saying this is the city of God, to refer to St. Augustine of Hippo. This is where all problems will vanish. No, he is simply saying here is where defense of body and property is enforced as the fundamental principle of the constitution of the place. By constitution, I do not mean a piece of paper. I mean the particular form of the polis. It's constitution. Imagine you're in class and you're in a constitutional law class, and you're supposed to bring a copy of the written constitution of the country. And you show up late, so you forgot and you didn't bring it. And there's a female student sitting next to you, and you turn to her when the professor of Introduction to Constitutional Law says, open the Constitution in article so such and such. And then you turn to her and you smile and you say, excuse me, miss, would you let me see your Constitution? This is what I mean by Constitution. To conclude remarks, caring about properly understood freedom is not synonymous with being a utopian idealist. My book is about providing a single criterion of law as a fundamental principle for constitutional anarchy. That is, a settlement, or samenleving in Dutch or Flemish, where there is no imperium or enforcement, but defense of body and property. That is what is binding, what has force of law. There is no execution of contracts or punishment. There may be restitution of proven victims by proven aggressors by means of the juridical figure of the estoppel. You can read Kinsella's treatise on the estoppel, proportionality, and punishment. Suppose someone won. To gain in Spanish means also to win, ganar. Someone won who could impose freedom from the top. What would be necessary to make such an instance not a contradiction, but a paradox? I say that individual, financial, political, personal, and legal freedom there, in that place, should be greater than elsewhere in the present, that is, in that moment in history, and in the past. If in a place freedom is imposed from the top, but that place has greater freedom by comparison than everywhere else, now and in the past, then there's no contradiction. In my book, contracts are dismissed as a category of law, in line with the position taken by Konkin that all force that is not defensive, constraining, restitutive, and proportional is excessive and therefore illegitimate. In the Spanish, the word contrato contains the word trato. Trato means a deal. Contrato means contract. Maltrato means maltreatment. So deals are always good. We learned from Austrian economics that when two people form part of an exchange and the exchange happens, that necessarily is good for both persons. Both persons think that they benefit in the moment. So I say, deals are always good. But contracts are always maltreatment, and maltreatment is always bad. Also, in the tradition of Samuel Konkin's coining terms and neologisms, I, according to this measure, do not talk about the zero aggression principle or the non-aggression principle, but the point of active disqualification. A principle you apply to different situations is not a rule. A rule is for a particular situation. And that is too ethereal. A point is very concrete. And in a universe of potentially infinite physical points, a single point that you should avoid touching, the physical materiality, the body and property of others, is something very easy to avoid. And why do I say disqualification? We disqualify the institution of the nation state because it violates that point. The state is an illegitimate social institution, an enemy of mankind, an outlaw, because its fundamental basis rests on the point of active disqualification. That is the realm of impermissible actions. At the beginning of the book, I make recommendations of which laws should be repealed. A call for reform that is not per se an act of hate speech, incitement, sedition, treason, tax revolt, harassment, but friendly suggestions of legal reform to make hate speech, harassment, incitement, sedition, treason, tax evasion, all non-criminally punishable activities. That is, to repeal the laws that deem freedom criminal and make progress towards freedom impossible. I make a suggestion in the book of how not voters, not taxpayers, not citizens, not owners, but inhabitants could, in federation, let the legislative branch know that they do not represent them. That is, that just because there are elections, this does not legitimize their exercise of power, and that they, the inhabitants, request unilaterally and in a binding manner that their only activity be circumscribed to dismantling the state by repealing the laws relevant and international treaties that enable the enforcement of such laws. I mock the materialists in the book for failing to understand things that were not givens in the past, such as for failing to understand things that were givens in the past, such as that the institutions and mores, traditions repudiating incest, for example, were not reducible to mere questions of arbitrary preference about the location of bodies in space, bodies made out of matter. I mention also in a chapter how, from the standpoint of the inhabitants and of the disparity of power between the armed men of the state and the general population, the danger the institution of the state posits is similar to that of a child confronted by a pedophile, so that all means necessary to identify and neutralize can be presumed as justified. Bite, scream, pull hair, poke eyes. This is in coherence with the criminal law of the enemy combatant, with the theory of the criminal law of the enemy combatant of Gunther Jacobs, where those seen as the enemy of mankind, this is a technical legal term, like those who were enslavers after the abolition of slavery were considered without the protection of the law. Where those seen as the enemy of mankind are considered without protection of the law because of their unrepentant and unceasing criminal activities. An example of this can be the assassination of SS Nazi Reinhard Heydrich in June 4, 1942 in Prague by merely wearing the SS uniform. I present a discharge of responsibility, a caveat emptor for my work, to the effect that a controlled demolition, a ceasefire in the Cold War against the inhabitants by those who wield power is not a call to arms, but that if others took my suggested principles and tried to manifest them in the world of political institutions, they are personally responsible, not me. After all, Montesquieu died in 1755, 44 years before the end of the French Revolution in 1799, where his ideas of the trias politica, the division of the legislative, executive, and judicial branches of power, were put into practice. Recently, Janusz Korwin-Mikke from Poland condemned the January uprising in Poland as having been a murderously unwise decision that led to the loss of lives, and how it is only sending young men to die to provoke insurrections when they cannot be won. Inspired by the deuterocanonical book of the Wisdom of Solomon, apocryphal to non-traditional Christians, which opens with rulers of the earth love justice, and the idea by Rothbard that just because professions and sectors of the economy are currently monopolized by the state, like the bodyguard function of a policeman, or the dispute settlement function of a judge, that doesn't mean that they would cease to exist in a stateless order of law. To this effect, freedom is taken as God's greatest gift to man, a necessary condition to choose Jesus as one's Redeemer and escaped lamb, and therefore the supreme political and legal value in this world. Freedom is the absolute value in this world. Salvation may be the highest value in the next world, and that is left in the hands of Christ. This means that the spirit of the legitimate use of force, l'esprit de loi, is to prevent irreversible physical harm or damage to persons. I repeat that. The spirit of the law is to prevent irreversible physical damage and harm to persons, to real, identifiable physical persons. All other uses of force being criminal, intolerable, destructive, unacceptable. In this sense, freedom as a fact is taken to have a metaphysical, epistemological, and spiritual aspect. Freedom as non-predictable indeterminism, as variability, whether genetic or behavioral, the fact that you cannot, with an algorithm, predict what a person is going to do, is seen as what makes life life, and not just the inert interactions of particles and matter. Particles and matter behave according to the determined periodic table of the elements, the decay of atomic isotopes. Life relies on variability, whether genetic or behavioral. Imagine our freedom relied on each other. Imagine that our passivity or activity, human action, will yield North Korea or a free society with everything in between, like Singapore. The situation is one of emergency, fight or flight. We can overthrow the state, neutralize its actions, or repeal its laws and eventually replace it with a new constitution with a new criterion. The first two options are more or less out of the question, at least for now. This new constitutional criterion prevents the natural intuitions people have in their desire for security to get in the way of anything but the maximum interpersonal, institutional, geographical, financial, political, bodily freedom possible, imaginable, being the only element of what is important. This criterion, towards which all law has to be repealed, is the free and unrestricted self-defense of the physical materiality of real persons, comprised by their body and physical, movable and immovable things. That is what my book is about. I have killed the state with the help of Christ. Just when everyone thought that God was dead and that ideas could be owned, I stole your forceful idea, and now the state is dead. I will now read a few excerpts from the book. He abused me. The question, why did I kill him? The judge told me, death does not extinguish the obligations of the debtor. And no matter how many Lord's prayers, he owed me far too much for being a catejon, perverter of the book of Romans 13, thief, son of a bitch. After all he did to me, I had no choice. I could not let his successors keep what is mine. I had to abolish him, forbid him to write a book. In Spanish, tuve que abolirlo, que prohibirlo, que escribir el libro. Besides, Higgs had already said so. He was too dangerous to tolerate. We know well what he would have done to us because he had done it to others. I had to drag myself through the mud to hide between monks and nobles trying to find that address, written on a paper, underlined between the lines of the poem. Granada Way, 1492. This quote is in reference to the last battle of the Reconquest of Spain, which took place in Granada in 1492. And the idea that originally poetry was epic, like the Odyssey or the Iliad. It told the story of heroes such as Achilles, or for the Spaniards, the song of El Cid, the medieval knight, Rodrigo y el de Vivar, as well as the fact that the seed or password of an amount of cryptocurrency can be stored in a piece of paper with a few words that can be easily memorized, like a prayer. Now, a second quote. The state must be killed because it doesn't even exist. There are only small men with weapons bought with stolen money. The state, separate from those who want to live from what is stolen from others, does not exist. And that is why it must die, because it is false. This book tells you how it must disappear, so that the law survives, so that Christ reigns, so that between wars, poverty, and duty, love, not power, triumphs. Cease to robbery. Third quote. In light of all this, I have killed the state. In theory, this taken to practice, as mentioned by Professor Thorstein Polleit, bears good analogy with a work by Tolkien, The Lord of the Rings. And if the analogy is valid, in our view, the ring to be destroyed is that of binding enforcement, of obligatory compliance and execution with force of law, of anything but all those cases of strict self-defense of what is one's own. As I said before, the physical materiality, movable and immovable goods of the person, concept which objectifies in a practical manner the meaning of freedom. I have spoken. Now we will take any questions from the present audience.
Yeah, I would like to say something related to this, that well, guys, after this extended explanation that our friend recently did, so I don't know if you have any doubts or questions to this. Please.
Yeah, I might have a few questions, but I want to preface the question by saying that I only had, since this evening, the time to read through your speech and kind of formulate questions. So apologies if they aren't well thought out or
Please go ahead.
or
Go ahead,
easily
please. Yeah, it's okay.
rejectable. But I want to start out with the your paraphrasing of one of Nietzsche's sayings regarding becoming what one is. And
Worden.
yes, and you mentioned that Nietzsche mentioned that the easiest way is to look back to your traditional roots in order to become what one is. But my interpretation of Nietzsche's writing was rather that Nietzsche advocated for a transcendence of these traditions from which one is rooted, and it's what he meant was that those were supposed to be examined critically so that they can be transcended towards true individuation. So sort of letting go of these traditions and to analyze them critically to forge your own path. So I think that, and in accordance with more this idea of Nietzsche's writing, I guess one question would be, how do you reconcile, for example, the Reconquista, which, sorry, I made some notes.
If I may comment, make a
Yeah.
few comments as you look up your notes. That klopt. The fact is that Nietzsche said the purpose of society is to create great individuals, and man is something that must be overcome. The historical collective of man. Nobody would deny that state law, the political science concept of the nation state, constitutional, democratic, universal suffrage, representative republics or monarchies, is the result of our tradition of Western law, the French revolutionaries, the American revolutionaries, and after World War II, social democracy, the welfare state. What I merely mean to say is that it seems to be a coincidence of interests. I believe Ayn Rand said rational men's interests do not come into conflict. The coincidence of interests are between human action in the Rothbardian most individual sense. I do whatever I want as long as I don't initiate force against others. And the traditionally Spanish history where the ideas of Marx, of Lenin, of Montesquieu, of Hobbes, of Locke are not authentically Spanish. They are foreign. It would seem, and for disclosure, as a lawyer, you're rhetorically trained to just read a body of work and argue for whatever case, client, and victory you happen to be fighting. It would seem as though there is a Spanish tradition of regarding tyranny and totalitarianism. The totalitarianism that does not let you individually pursue your ends as an entrepreneur. That is compatible with libertarianism, that of Juan de Mariana, if the king is a tyrant, you can kill the king, that of Francisco Suarez, the sovereignty rests on the people, not on the ruler, and many other anarchist ideas that are not necessarily in common with Europe, with the rest of Europe, with Europe on the other side of the Pyrenees. Some other libertarians have said we should have open borders and nationalism, and even if those are not truly libertarian ideas, because of the modern concept of the nation not being traditionally libertarian, we should close the borders, repatriate foreigners from different cultures, and so on. Well, what I pointed out during my speech is that if you said, actually, we should open the borders to 780 million Latin Americans who are Western people with a Western background, with a Western culture, whatever their skin color or IQ may be, you would not be importing foreigners per se. The Western tradition would not be foreign to them. It would seem, if freedom is a criterion of progress, that means on a Cartesian plane, forward being whatever goes towards freedom, that there are some milestones. First, self-described anarcho-libertarian, anarcho-capitalist president elected in the world was from the Spanish-speaking world. First president to arrest all the gangs was Bukele. In the formerly Spanish Netherlands, where I currently reside, a few years back, some persons, homosexual professor and the great-grandnephew of a Dutch painter, were murdered for being too controversial in their opinions. This is truly horrible, I think, not only to Europeans, but also to Latin Americans. And so I see a rhetorical opportunity to inspire the Latin Americans, the Spanish speakers, which includes European Spain and Portugal, to get rid of what they should get rid of from their tradition and pursue what I think it was St. Paul who said, look at everything, examine everything, and keep what is good.
Yeah, I think that is more in line with what Nietzsche meant with looking at tradition in order to transcend the self into the most actualized individual. But could you maybe explain to me how you reconcile this idea with your going back to Christian traditions? And my question specifically would be that in your speech where you referenced the Reconquista as a fight for Christian freedom, you don't seem to address the more forced conversions and expulsion of the Muslim communities and Jewish communities at the time. And I bring this up only because before the Reconquista, and especially also during the early Reconquista, there's many records that state a very intellectual transfer and relationship between those different communities.
Yes,
I have a few examples actually.
Let me give one. It's the Aristotle works being translated from Arabic into Spanish.
Spanish.
They were lost to the West.
The
Yes.
capital of Muslim under Muslim rule. I don't know the name.
The Sharia.
Is it called?
Cordoba?
I'm very sorry.
Or Granada.
I wrote it
I will
down
try
here.
to nevertheless answer your question as is. I will probably address this also in my upcoming book, Cordoba. Yes, that is where Lucius Annius Seneca, the great Stoic philosopher, lived.
Which was also known for its inclusion of all
Approximately around the same time of Christ lived Seneca, Cordoba. I will address this in my upcoming book. What I should say is this. Christianity understood literally by looking at the canonical work of the Gospels and the works of the New Testament. In theory, in what it promotes, is the ethics of Christ: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Love God above all things. He says, "My peace I give you; my peace I leave with you. Love each other as I have loved you, because then they will know you are my followers." It does not say in Christianity, "Go and conquer the world so that they convert to our position." The word hostis in Latin, from which hostility and hostile comes from, means enemy, the opposite of amigo, friend. In the same Gospel of John, Christ says, "Because I have explained to you what it is that I ask of you, I don't call you my servants, but friends." Obviously, starting from the non-aggression principle, anyone may enter into a community, and as long as they do not initiate force against others, this is not a problem. From the standpoint of what John von Neumann has called game theory asymmetry, if there was a religion that has a doctrine that you should, by conquest, by all means necessary, convert others, not a religion whose founding person was someone who was killed by the political authorities, killed by his people, betrayed by one of his disciples, but a faith of a warrior who is expelled from his polis, his city-state. He convinces the aristocrats of the other polis to then go and take over. And if you have a religion that says, if you feel you are under attack for your beliefs. You may lie, something incompatible with let your yes be yes, let your no be no, the truth shall set you free. There is a sociological problem. Professor Kinniking has recently said that if you have logically incompatible worldviews, you can keep each to your side, live side by side with each other, or fight. I think this is too false and unsophisticated, too rough, too broad. Because I can agree that a religion that demands in the book to go and conquer by force and lie if necessary will, over the long run, have mutually compatible logical problems with libertarian law, which will not be readily determinable when someone of such a religion says, and I promise to abide by libertarian law, subordinating my beliefs to libertarian law. You end up with one of those statements like every statement is a lie, this statement too. It is not readily determinable whether you are just perceived instrumental as something related to your ends. Now, of course, anyone who is familiar with Thomas Saz knows that ad hominem attacks, insults like sociopath, psychopath, etc., are a very reductionist way of insulting. But there is something to be said about seeing in the other and in the other's presence, material presence in this world, as nothing other than a tool for peace. If peace for you means subjugation, a word like shalom means peace. Salam in Arabic means peace. These languages don't have vowels. So Islam is related to peace. But a Pax Romana, the order maintained by a conquering agency, is not true peace in the libertarian sense. The Crown of England receives its legitimacy from the conquest of William the Conqueror of Normandy. The reason why the monarch of England is presumed to be legitimate is because the Normans conquered. And before World War II and the invasion of Poland and the Sudetenland, this was a principle of political science and foundational to law. That no one has a greater interest in the stability of a country than he who took it for themselves. Well, this is all very sophisticated, but facts are facts. Spain was Hispano-Roman. There were Celts and mostly Hispano-Romans. They were Christians. By the end of the 5th century, the Roman Empire collapses. Spain is invaded by Visigoths. They speak a Germanic language. They see a more sophisticated Hispano-Roman culture. They adopt their language. And then they adopt the religion. And then they sin. The division and divorce between women and men of the assets, the estate, that comes from the Visigoth. The honoring women and what was theirs. After a vacuum of power, the Visigoths come, they conquer Spain, but they absorb the language and the religion of the already existing Spaniards. When the invasion of Spain happens from North Africa, as a consequence of jihad and places like Egypt, where origin of Alexandria, the first Christian genius, become Muslim countries under Sharia law, or wherever Hippo, where St. Augustine was from, also become conquered. And Spain is conquered all the way to the northwest, Asturias and Galicia, and Asturias and Galicia. The idea is not our religion is better than theirs, and we're gonna do everything to take our land back. It's more of a sensibility, the sensibility that allowed them to live there side by side in the first place before the conquest, that you cannot have certain aspects of the confusion, confundere, welding together of the theological with the liturgical, as a lifestyle that is compatible with don't resist your enemies, turn the other cheek, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That there's an inherently totalitarian aspect that is incompatible with our lifestyle. Our lifestyle in the secular, atheist, modern Western European world being shaped in its cultural intuitions by 2,000 years of Christianity, 500 years of Christianity at the time. So I can tell you one thing, the Moriscos, the descendants of the Moorish in Spain, in Valencia, they engaged in division of labor. They had to convert or leave, and so a lot of them converted, like when the Jews had to convert or leave. A lot of them were baptized. They had stopped speaking Arabic, and they spoke Spanish. They worked mostly in the fields of Valencia. The aristocracy of Valencia looked down on them. And at some point, they convinced the crown to expel them. Within 2 years or 3 years, in 1660, they were just shipped off to North Africa, where their ancestors came from, without any kind of compensation for their property, their assets, etc. Even though they were formerly Christians, even though they spoke Spanish, even though they engaged peacefully in division of labor. Obviously, if I were dictator, emperor of history and the world, that would not have happened under my rule. But that is already anachronistic. That already involves taking principles and worldviews from now and applying them to the past. I think that, of course, Christianity, because of certain passages in St. Paul says, now you are not slave or master, woman or man, but you are one in Christ, led to the fact that Queen Isabel, Elizabeth of Castile, told the conquistadors, you cannot enslave the natives, you need to baptize them. And then the encomienda system was make sure that they, who had religious human sacrifice, the Incas and the Aztecs, it's well known, that they, the Indians, are brought into Christian customs because they are a province of my realm, they are my subjects. They cannot be enslaved. And the early abolitionist movement in the Anglo-Saxon world were Christians. They saw the institution of slavery as incompatible with Christianity. Now, that is not to say that thinking of slavery as horrible is an anachronism from our age. You could not say that to the people of the past. It was just what they were born with, and it is what it is. There had always been slavery in the Western world and all the world in up to the 19th century. Well, that was not true with the Crown of Spain, with the provinces, with the mestizos, with the natives. And while one may say that, that one would not be me. And why would it not be? Because I am a Christian, and I find, and I am Spanish, and I find slavery contrary to Christianity. It's obvious any libertarian would find slavery contrary to Christianity. There's still slavery of women, slave trade for sexual purposes. You don't have to be a libertarian or a Christian to have that intuition. You could be a feminist. But both a libertarian, a Christian, and a feminist have received the cultural heritage of 2,000 years of Christianity, which is very unique. No other culture in the world has come up with Rothbardian anarcho-libertarians, or freedom in the sense we understand it. Now, that's a very long answer, but I have tried to address your concerns. Do we have any more questions?
Good. So I don't know if this.
Any more questions, guys?
Let me know if my answer has satisfied your.
Well, my purpose really was just to kind of engage with the speech, and it allowed you to kind of elaborate on what you wrote for your audience. So I think.
Yeah, and of course, just
Thanks for that.
Just you will understand it's a very controversial topic in light of current European events.
I think mostly just because this repurposing of old Christian traditions.
Yeah. I love my, the followers of Muhammad and the followers of rabbinic Judaism. I love them. I respect their body and their property. And I pray for them that they come to the light.
Yeah,
I don't reserve myself the right to define what the light will be for them.
I understand. And it wasn't even a criticism at Christianity per se. It was more because you also state in your speech that God is not dead, or you revive God and you kill the state instead, using the God that died. But I think the sentiment. Rhetoric. Yeah, I know it's rhetoric, but I think the sentiment for God is dead comes from the idea that looking back at history, I mean, everyone would agree that traditional Christian values have something are commendable, but the problem is that throughout history we cannot look back and say that there hasn't been all of these atrocities in
perhaps,
and that's why God is dead, because we cannot, as rational beings, we cannot say that, oh yes, by adhering to these traditional values, we will live a free, prosperous life in line with these libertarian ideals, because we know that those people who preached the word of God clearly did not manifest this idea.
If I may
Yeah.
say, apropos of what you mentioned, Clarence, what I intend to say, the bedoeling is that you could not take what is written in the book that Christ said and commit atrocities, and then say there is no logical contradiction by referring to the literary materials. This is particularly unique because it is not a reinterpretation of the written materials. Now, there is something that I would like to emphasize in what you mentioned. Reviving the God that is dead. Even if I were so weak in my metaphysical belief that it was incomprehensible, almost unintelligible, other than by literary material revealed sources, to grasp the concept of God. I believe that I do not commit any idolatry, therefore no apostasy, no heresy, when I view the physical person of Jesus of Nazareth who died on the cross, according to multiple historical sources, not only from strictly Christian views. But be that as it may, I believe that I don't commit a heresy, an idolatry, or an apostasy when I worship him, the man, Jesus of Nazareth, as God. So when I say that God has died maybe for you, well, I could quote passages that say, wherever two come in my name, I am in between them. And now you are part of the body of Christ. He is the head, and we are the body. To refer to Christendom as the community of persons in the family, in the convivial order. But I insist, that is my personal choice. He himself said, with the Pharisees, with the temple, those who sent him to be killed by the judicial power of Rome, Pontius Pilate. Listen to what they say, but don't act the way they do, because they do not practice what they preach. So taking the book literally, and taking from the book literally, just underlining what came from the man himself, you could not, with logical coherence, and archeno logos, in the beginning was a word, logos, logic. With logical coherence, you cannot derive from the written material text of Christianity the idea of conquest by force. And yet it happened. It happened in the Americas, where there was human sacrifice, when in Spain there was no longer any human sacrifice that was thought to be paid off in the body of Christ. So I may give you my idea of the greatest good and the greatest evil, but there are also historical considerations in the day-to-day living that involve not only what is strictly Christian, but also better and worse. What are the alternatives? I would prefer to have a better alternative than a worse alternative. I think this is praxeologically true. With that, we have been going for 1 hour and 38 minutes. The presentation to the Spanish-speaking world in the podcast No hay almuerzo gratis, literally a quote, there is no free lunch, the quote by David Friedman, will begin soon. So for all those present, I thank you. I thank the viewers and listeners on the live stream, and we will proceed to the conviviality, the parochial conviviality of just mingling and talking about lighter subjects. Thank you very much.